The silence was the first sign, a gnawing, unsettling silence that seemed to seep into every corner of the room, wrapping itself around him like a cold, invisible shroud. He glanced at the corner of his desk, expecting to see the small, furry form of Whiskers nestled in his cage, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. But the cage was empty. The door hung ajar, swinging slightly as if it had been recently disturbed. He felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine, a sensation that grew stronger with each passing second. The little guy never strayed this far, not without reason. Whiskers was always there, a constant, comforting presence in his otherwise chaotic life. He moved towards the window, fingers drumming against the cool glass, his mind racing with possibilities. Where could Whiskers have gone? Who could have taken him? His eyes scanned the street below, 5th Street, bathed in the harsh glare of the afternoon sun. The usual hustle and bustle of the city seemed distant, almost surreal. It was then he saw him, Mark, the man who had been a thorn in his side for as long as he could remember. Leaning against a lamppost, a lit cigarette dangling from his lips, Mark exuded an air of casual menace. His presence could only mean trouble. Mark never showed up without a reason, and it was never a good one. He needed to leave. Now. The urgency of the situation hit him like a freight train. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. He couldn't let Mark see him, not here, not when he was so close to achieving his goal. The stakes were too high, and the risks too great. He grabbed his jacket, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. The sound of his own heartbeat echoed in his ears, a constant reminder of the danger he was in. Every rustle of paper, every creak of the floorboard sounded deafening in the silence left by Whiskers' absence. He was trapped in a web of uncertainty and fear, with no clear way out. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing in, suffocating him with their oppressive silence. He had to find Whiskers. He had to figure out what Mark was up to, and he had to do it fast before it was too late. He slipped out of the back entrance, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. The night was thick with tension, every shadow a potential threat. He could feel the weight of the city's gaze upon him, an invisible pressure that made his heart race. His car was parked a block away, a silver beacon in the sea of asphalt and concrete. It seemed so close, yet impossibly far. Each step towards it felt like a gamble, a roll of the dice in a game he wasn't sure he could win. He kept his head down, hoping to melt into the throngs of people bustling along the sidewalk. The crowd was his shield, a moving camouflage that he prayed would keep him hidden. He moved with purpose, but not too quickly, trying to appear as just another face in the urban tide. But Mark had a knack for appearing when least desired, a sixth sense for sniffing out trouble. It was as if he could smell fear, and right now, it was pouring off him in waves. Mark's presence was a dark cloud, always looming, always threatening. He could practically feel Mark's eyes on him, tracking his every move. It was a sensation that made his skin crawl, a constant reminder that he was never truly alone. The city was vast, but Mark's reach seemed to stretch across every corner. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The street behind him was a blur of motion, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was there somewhere, hidden in plain sight. His pulse quickened, a drumbeat of anxiety that echoed in his ears. Mark was no longer leaning against the lamppost. Panic tightened its grip. The absence was more terrifying than his presence. It meant Mark was on the move, closing in, and he had no idea from which direction the threat would come. He picked up his pace, his footsteps echoing in the narrow alleyways he chose to navigate. The alleys were a maze, a labyrinth of concrete and shadows that he hoped would throw Mark off his trail. But every echo seemed to mock him, a reminder that he was being hunted. The air grew thick with the smell of garbage and exhaust fumes. It was a pungent mix that clung to his clothes and filled his lungs, but it did little to mask the metallic tangs of fear that coated his tongue. The city was alive with its own kind of menace, a backdrop to his personal nightmare. It did little to mask the metallic tang of fear that coated his tongue. Every breath was a struggle, every heartbeat a countdown. He could feel the walls closing in, the city itself conspiring to trap him. He could hear footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate. Each step was a reminder that he was not alone, that Mark was drawing closer. The sound was a metronome of dread, ticking away the moments he had left. He didn't need to turn around to know it was Mark. The presence was unmistakable, a dark shadow that loomed over his every move. He could feel the weight of Mark's gaze, a predator's focus that promised no escape. The game was nearing its end, and he was running out of moves. Well, look who we have here. Mark's voice was a low growl, sending shivers down his spine. It was the kind of voice that could make even the bravest man falter, a voice that carried the weight of unspoken threats and hidden dangers. He plastered a fake smile on his face, hoping to mask the fear gnawing at his insides. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the precarious situation he found himself in. He had to play it cool, pretend he hadn't noticed Mark's watchful gaze. The last thing he needed was to show any sign of weakness. "Mark, fancy seeing you here," he said, his voice an octave higher than usual. He tried to inject some cheerfulness into his tone, but it came out strained and unnatural. He cursed himself for sounding so nervous. Why couldn't he just act normal? Why did Mark always have this effect on him? Mark chuckled, a humorless sound that set his teeth on edge. It was a laugh devoid of any real amusement, a sound that only served to heighten his anxiety. "Just out for a stroll," Mark said, taking a long drag from his cigarette. The smoke curled around his face, adding to the menacing aura that surrounded him. "Funny, I didn't know you frequented this part of town." His words were casual, but there was an underlying tension that couldn't be ignored. "Business," he muttered, shoving his hands deep into his pockets. He hoped the gesture would hide his trembling fingers. "You know how it is." He tried to sound nonchalant, but the quiver in his voice betrayed him. Every word felt like a lie. He could see the skepticism in Mark's eyes, the way he seemed to dissect every syllable. Every second in Mark's presence was pure agony. The air felt thick with tension, each moment stretching into an eternity. He just needed to get away, to disappear into the crowd. The bustling city around them seemed like a lifeline, a chance to escape the suffocating encounter. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the next move. Maybe, just maybe, he could slip away unnoticed. "Actually," Mark drawled, blowing a plume of smoke into the air, "I was thinking about grabbing a drink. Care to join me? Bailey's is just around the corner." His blood ran cold. Bailey's. It was the last place he wanted to be seen, the last place he wanted to step foot in. He had to come up with an excuse, and fast. "Oh, you know me," he chuckled, desperately trying to appear nonchalant. "Not a big drinker, and I'm actually running late for a meeting." Mark raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowed. He wasn't buying it, he never bought it. "Come on," Mark pressed, taking a step closer. "One drink, my treat." He was trapped. He couldn't refuse without raising suspicion, and suspicion was the last thing he needed right now. Section 5, Calculated Deception. He reluctantly agreed, allowing Mark to steer him towards Bailey's. With every step, his heart hammered louder, a frantic drum against his ribs. He needed a plan, a way to prevent the inevitable. His eyes scanned the street, searching for an escape route, a distraction, anything. Then he saw her, Sarah. She was exiting a bakery across the street, her arms laden with boxes of pastries. A wave of relief washed over him. This was his chance. "Hold that thought, Mark," he said, injecting as much casualness into his voice as he could muster. "I need to grab something for my meeting." Before Mark could protest, he darted across the street, dodging honking cars and irritated shouts. He reached Sarah, his heart still pounding in his chest. "Sarah, thank God you're a lifesaver," he greeted her with a relieved smile, hoping he looked less panicked than he felt. Sarah looked up, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. "It's me," he whispered, leaning in close, hoping Mark wasn't close enough to hear. "We need to talk. Now." He glanced back at Bailey's, searching for Mark's silhouette through the smoky windows. He couldn't see him, but that didn't mean he wasn't there, his gaze fixed on them like a hawk, eyeing its prey. He needed to make this look convincing. He grabbed a box of pastries from Sarah's grasp, feigning a look of delight. "These look incredible. Just what I needed for my meeting." "Meeting?" Sarah questioned, her confusion growing. "I don't understand. Just play along," he hissed, keeping his voice low. He steered her away from Bailey's, towards a quieter side street. He could feel Mark's gaze burning into his back. "What's going on?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with alarm. "Who was that man?" "I don't have time to explain," he said, his voice tight with tension. "I just need you to do something for me." He leaned in close, his lips brushing against her ear as he spoke. He needed to get a message to her, a message that could change everything, a message only she could deliver. He watched as Sarah disappeared into the crowd, her head held high, her steps purposeful. He hoped he could trust her. He had no other choice. He turned back towards Bailey's, his heart heavy with dread. He had to face Mark eventually. He just hoped he'd bought himself enough time. He pushed open the doors to Bailey's, the familiar scent of stale beer and fried food washing over him. The bar was dimly lit, filled with the murmur of conversations and the clinking of glasses. He spotted Mark at a table by the window, his gaze dark and intense. He took a deep breath and walked towards him, bracing himself for the confrontation. "There you are," Mark said, his voice laced with suspicion. "What was that all about?" He concocted a story, a web of lies that sounded almost plausible. He spoke of a mix-up with the meeting location, of a last-minute change of plans. He watched Mark's face carefully, searching for any flicker of disbelief. To his relief, Mark seemed to buy it, or maybe he was just tired of waiting. Either way, the tension that had coiled around him began to ease. He had kept his secret safe, for now. But as he left Bailey's that night, the weight of his deception settled heavily on his shoulders. He had avoided disaster this time, but he knew this was far from over. Mark was still out there,